It was an ordinary morning in a small but well-known clinic where patients hoped to find professional medical help and care. No one could have imagined that soon the usual rhythm of life here would be disrupted by tragedy. The quiet whispers of discontent, the rustling of medical charts, and the humming of machines suddenly seemed like ominous harbingers of impending disaster. The story centers on a black girl who came to the appointment with her parents. She had simple complaints, and everyone expected the examination to go smoothly and the treatment to be effective. But something subtly changed when the girl found herself in the doctor's office. It would seem that in this place everything is set up to provide care and attention, but this time something was wrong. The doctor's gaze lingered on the girl for a second longer than necessary. An inexpressible coldness was reflected in his eyes, and a slight shadow slid across his face, as if foreshadowing something evil. The doctor assigned to examine the girl looked like a seasoned professional, but he had one flaw that often went unnoticed: a deep-seated bias. This invisible darkness hovering over him that day led to a decision that turned tragic. The doctor, whose views were colored by bias and latent hatred, decided not to follow standard recommendations, as if the girl's life didn't deserve the same care as any other patient's. It was this moment that became the starting point for a whole series of events, the consequences of which no one could foresee. For no good reason, the doctor ignored the prescription and gave the girl a drug that was not suitable for her. It would seem that it was just a small mistake, but it quickly turned into something much more serious. In a few minutes, the girl began to pale. Her breathing became intermittent, and her gaze faded like a candle flame about to be blown away by a gust of wind. Soon rumors began to spread in the clinic. The staff began to whisper in alarm. No one expected that a simple visit to the doctor would lead to such a rapid deterioration of the patient's condition. It seemed as if fate itself had brought this family here, as if to uncover the dark roots of hatred and indifference hidden behind the mask of a medical coat. But neither the doctors, nor the nurses, nor the perpetrator of the tragedy himself knew one important fact. The girl's father, the one who would soon find out everything, was not just a concerned parent. He was a man whose power and influence extended throughout the hospital. At the moment when the sick girl lay on the couch, her father, who had so much trust in the doctors of this clinic, did not yet know what a blow he would have to endure. This story is not just about medical error. It's about bias and how invisible vices can be fatal. Here, within the walls of a hospital where every patient should feel safe, one dark soul violated the Hippocratic Oath, endangering someone who only needed care and attention. Dr. Conrad Ellis was known as a man who always preferred to keep to himself. Dry, reserved, he rarely showed his true emotions, and his patients sometimes felt this coldness like a touch of ice. In the past, he had been considered a good specialist, and few realized that deep down he carried a darkness that was barely visible to others, but could be felt in his every step. The dark shadows of the past enveloped him like a cloak, which he carefully hid from prying eyes. Conrad Ellis was born into a family where views of the world were harsh and categorical. His childhood was characterized by strict morals, prejudice, and closed-mindedness to all things foreign and obscure. His family believed that the world was divided into their own and strangers, and unfortunately, these views were deeply ingrained in young Conrad's mind, shaping his understanding of people and their worth. Even when he began studying medicine, his hunger for knowledge and professional reputation could not completely erase the prejudicial beliefs he had absorbed from childhood. At the university, Conrad was reserved and stayed away from students who looked different or had a different cultural background. His academic success and undoubted talents in medicine hid his inner world, but no matter how hard he tried, sometimes a shadow of contempt and cold alienation could be seen in his gaze. His professors noted his outstanding abilities, but they also noticed that Conrad preferred to work with certain patients, avoiding others as if they were less worthy of his attention. His career progressed, but as his professional skills grew, so did the dark traits he had inherited and reinforced over the years. Becoming a doctor gave him power over the lives of his patients, and this feeling endowed him with a dangerous sense of superiority. He hid his prejudices beneath a mask of professionalism, and though most patients didn't notice it, there was a subtle bias in his actions. When Conrad took a job in a small private clinic, it seemed like the right place for him, far enough away from the limelight that he didn't have to worry too much about how he was doing his job. His habits and attitudes stayed with him, and as a rule, no one questioned his decisions. But his reserved, almost machine-like attitude toward patients sometimes made his colleagues wonder how Conrad felt about his work. He was always one step ahead in his practice, but not because he loved medicine. He was motivated by something else, a sense of superiority, the ability to decide who deserved his care and who might not. There were sometimes whispered rumors among colleagues that Conrad might deliberately pay less attention to patients he considered unsuitable. These rumors were never confirmed by anyone, but as is the case with secrets, something about them always remains true. One day, a young nurse overheard him speaking contemptuously of ungrateful patients, whom he felt had no place in their clinic. But the words were spoken in a low voice, and no one paid any attention to them. For Conrad Ellis always remained an inviolable figure within the walls of the clinic. He was experienced enough to realize that his decisions could be fatal for someone, and understanding this gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. Each of his appointments was carefully calculated. Each injection and prescription seemed simple, but there was an invisible, almost manic pride in them. He was the doctor who decided who to help and who to pretend to help. No one in the clinic knew that on the day the black girl was in his office, he had decided to act in his usual secretive manner. To him, she was nothing more than a stranger, a child who didn't deserve the same level of care he gave to others. His decision to give her the over-the-counter injection wasn't just a mistake, but a display of deep, cold calculation. It was his quiet revenge for the invisible resentments he held in his soul, resentments he'd only taken out on those he considered beneath him. And so, it was as if fate had brought this doctor and this girl together, so that the secret shadows of his soul might become manifest, so that his bias could no longer hide behind the mask of a doctor. Her name was Amina, and despite her young age, she possessed a rare calmness and wisdom for a child. In her 10th year, she had already undergone several severe medical trials, which had hardened her character and taught her fortitude and patience. She was a girl with huge, brilliant eyes, which seemed to reflect the whole world, deep and full of mysteries. She was used to the hospital corridors and the cool silence of the wards. She often had to meet doctors, and although she was just a child, she had already learned to recognize those subtle intonations in their voices, sometimes kind, sometimes hurried, sometimes indifferent. Amina could sense when they really wanted to help her and when they treated her as a patient without genuine concern. Amina's family was her main source of strength. Her mother, caring and compassionate, was by her side every step of the way, as if sharing her every pain and fear. She surrounded Amina with love, trying to compensate for the difficulties she faced at such a young age. Amina's father, James Bryant, was a man who had earned respect in both his family and the medical world. He wasn't just successful, he was a man who started from the bottom and built his career piece by piece, achieving incredible success. A former physician, He later became the owner of a clinic, the same clinic where Dr. Conrad Ellis once found himself. James Bryant was a man of principle, integrity, and integrity. He built his hospital as a place where every patient could count on support and sincere help. His reputation as a fair and strict leader was known throughout the hospital. He knew each of his staff, respected their work, and always strove to ensure that the atmosphere in his hospital was warm and trusting. Although the staff did not always see him, he preferred to keep a low profile, relying on the chief physicians and administrators. Everyone knew that he kept a close eye on the hospital, but even Bryant couldn't always be there for Amina. He was often torn between caring for his daughter and his work, and although he tried to balance the two important parts of his life, he realized that sometimes he had to choose. He was used to trusting the doctors and specialists he selected for his hospital, trusting that each of them maintained high standards. But neither had he realized that perhaps one of those he trusted might have a hidden hatred that would eventually affect his own family. Amina knew that her father was always there for her, even if he wasn't physically there for her. She believed that his hands were there to protect her in every situation, even when she was scared. She went through every doctor's visit with a smile, even though sometimes there was a look of worry in her eyes. She had spent too much time among nurses, procedures, and cold medical offices, but that constant smile was her way of showing the world that she was strong and not giving up. When they arrived at the clinic that day, her parents were calm. It was just another procedure for them, and James, as the owner of the hospital, didn't doubt for a second that their daughter would receive proper care. He was used to seeing doctors treat his family with respect. After all, they knew who he was and what his name represented. But the doctor that Amina went to see that day was different. He didn't know or didn't want to know who she was or whose daughter she was. And perhaps this prejudiced indifference was the last straw in a series of events that would soon lead to tragedy. Amina didn't know that the doctor who looked at her with cold eyes had his own secret life, his own hidden world of bias and hatred. She just smiled, weakly, as she always did before an appointment, trying to suppress her excitement. She was used to doctors and accustomed to procedures, but at that moment something was wrong. In the back of her mind, she felt a subtle tension, but she didn't pay it any mind. She was a child, and though the adult world was sometimes frightening, she trusted that her parents would always protect her. No one knew that this particular visit would be the turning point that would reveal the dark sides of a clinic where a spirit of care and professionalism seemed to have always reigned. Even Amina's father, confident that his clinic was a safe place, had no idea that one of its doors hid a force that was ready to shatter his peaceful world. It was a gray and rainy day when the Bryant family entered the lobby of the hospital, where they were so familiar with every hallway, every door. For Amina, this visit was part of a now familiar routine, and although she didn't like these trips, she tried not to show an ounce of fear. She saw her father interacting with the staff with a smile, keeping the atmosphere in the clinic calm and confident. Her father, James Bryant, was confident that even today his daughter would receive proper care and attention. He had no idea that this day would be one of the darkest days of their lives. Amina held her mother's hand as she walked through the sterile corridors flooded with dim light, feeling the familiar warmth and support. Nurses, patients, and visitors bustled around. The hospital lived its life. At one point, they approached the reception desk, and for a moment it seemed to them that they were safe, that everything was under control. But behind that deceptive silence lurked a shadow, ready to fall upon them as soon as they entered the office. When Amina was invited inside, she was greeted by an unfamiliar physician, Dr. Conrad Ellis. His gaze, cold and almost aloof, lingered on her face with a faint tinge of contempt. Maybe someone else wouldn't have noticed this subtle change in his expression, but Amina felt that gaze, a gaze that seemed to cast her in shadow, to make her invisible, unwelcome. She instinctively moved closer to her mother, as if sensing something wrong. Dr. Ellis greeted them with an indifferent nod, making little secret of the fact that he had not the slightest sympathy for them. He seemed barely able to contain his contempt, as if their presence in the office were a burden to him. As he examined Amina, there was not a shred of warmth in his movements, and his hands seemed cold, like an instrument devoid of life. When he looked at the girl, there was no concern or understanding in his eyes. There was indifference, and something darker, hidden but palpable. He asked a few formal questions, looking past her as if she were an object requiring minimal attention. Every gesture he made, every answer sounded careless, tinged with mockery and distaste. He felt his superiority, and it was expressed in his voice, in the way he touched her blood pressure arm, barely touching, as if afraid to touch. To him, she was just a black girl, someone who didn't deserve the level of attention he, as a doctor, was obligated to give her. Usually, in such cases, doctors follow all prescriptions and instructions because the slightest mistake can lead to serious consequences. But Dr. Ellis decided to do something different. The thought flashed through his mind that it was not worth spending too much time and effort on such, that they did not deserve his professionalism and attention. To him, this visit was nothing more than a routine checkup, but he decided to make it even more superficial, unworthy of proper attention. He hadn't looked at her medical records. He hadn't checked prescriptions and instructions. He didn't see fit to follow the prescriptions, for to him, Amina was nothing more than an annoying presence. Her mother, sensing her growing anxiety, tried to ask a few questions about the treatment, but Conrad's answers were short, reserved, with a subtle contempt in his words. It was as if he hadn't heard her, answering as if he were speaking not to a caring mother, but to someone he didn't think deserved his attention. Amina's mother, wary and worried, felt this coldness coming from the doctor, but she found it hard to believe that it could affect her daughter's treatment. Like James Bryant, she believed that a clinic built on the principles of care and equality would always remain safe for their family. As Dr. Ellis approached the medicine cabinet, his gaze lingered on the vials. He knew which drug to give Amina, but at that moment the shadow of his prejudice, his dark beliefs, awoke inside him. He took an ampule of another drug not meant for children and without hesitation, headed for the girl. Her mother noticed that he hadn't checked the prescription, hadn't specified the dosage, but she thought it was a mere formality. He was a doctor, and of course, he knew what he was doing. When he administered the injection, the girl squirmed in pain but did not make a sound, accustomed to injections and procedures. However, as soon as the injection was given, her breathing became rapid and her face pale. The mother noticed her hands begin to shake as drops of sweat appeared on the girl's forehead. She jumped up, looking at the doctor in panic, but Conrad Ellis, as if not noticing what was happening, calmly removed the syringe without showing the slightest interest in the deterioration of the patient's condition. In response to her questions, he said that it happens and that it was just an adverse reaction, even though he knew what he had done. He threw Amina a brief look of indifference, as if she were not a person to him, but just a problem that needed to be removed from his schedule as quickly as possible. And then he simply walked away, leaving the girl and her mother alone, as if his mission was complete. Amina, already barely on her feet, still held onto her mother's hand, but her gaze went blank and her breathing became heavy and intermittent. The mother ran out of the office in a panic, screaming for help. Soon nurses came running, but the tragedy had already begun to unfold. The girl's condition was deteriorating before their eyes, and those who ran into the office looked at her anxiously, not realizing what had happened. At that moment, no one knew that behind it all was one person's decision, a decision dictated by the bias that had turned this visit into a nightmare. Dr. Conrad Ellis had been assigned to Amina's case since the morning she was handed her medical records. The document contained only the standard information familiar to most patients undergoing regular treatment. He flipped through the pages, but when he saw the girl's picture, his hand froze for a moment and displeasure flashed in his eyes. Perhaps it was imperceptible to those around him, but he himself felt an inner impulse of dislike. His lips pressed tightly together, and the thought flashed through his mind that he would have to waste his time on a child whom he felt was just another unwanted task for him. Conrad was an experienced doctor, and many considered him a professional, but only he knew that some of his decisions were colored by a shadow of bias and disgust. To him, people were not the same, and some patients in his eyes automatically received a lesser level of care than others. This vice, which no one realized, helped him remain invisible to his colleagues, but it also gave him a grim, hidden satisfaction. Conrad convinced himself that his assessments were reasonable, that some patients simply did not deserve his full attention. When he opened Amina's card and realized she was a dark-skinned girl, he couldn't hide a dismissive grin. The thought flashed through his mind that this was going to be another simple case that wasn't worth wasting energy on. He didn't even glance at the details of her medical history, for it didn't matter to him. Her condition seemed to him something unimportant, not requiring detailed attention. Another troubled family, he thought, closing the folder with annoyance. Just more people who demand special treatment just because they think it's their privilege. At this point, for Conrad, Amina was no more than a case on his patient list. It was ingrained in his mind that some people occupied his time undeservedly, and their lives were not equal to those he considered worthy. In fact, his view of patients was not determined by medical needs, but by his personal prejudices, which he carefully hid behind a facade of professionalism. This allowed him to continue his work unhindered, choosing whom to help, and whom he felt could be given the least amount of attention. When Amina entered the office with her mother, Conrad met them with a look of cold indifference. There was contempt in his eyes, as if he didn't see the people in front of him, but only an image that reminded him of his preconceived beliefs. It was a feeling he had tried to suppress, but this time it overcame him. His preconceptions clouded his professional judgment, and he consciously chose to ignore details that could have helped Amina. When Amina's mother tried to speak, explaining the situation and her daughter's condition, Conrad only nodded, barely listening to her words. There was a dry, mechanical precision in his movements, but not an ounce of involvement. His hands brushed over Amina's pulse, but he barely paid attention to the rate of her heartbeat, ignoring the symptoms that indicated possible complications. He diagnosed her with barely a glance, as if she were just a backdrop, and there was something in his words that would have alarmed any attentive listener: carelessness and indifference. Ignoring the data that might have indicated risks, Conrad focused only on finishing the exam as soon as possible. He knew what treatment was to be administered, but instead of following the prescriptions and orders, he chose to bypass them, believing it didn't matter for this kind of patient. He deliberately chose an injection that was not prescribed, knowing that it would not have the expected effect. But in his eyes, it wasn't a mistake. It was his right not to waste his energies on those he considered beneath him. Amina's mother, watching his actions, felt a growing unease. The doctor looking at her daughter seemed alien, indifferent, as if her child didn't deserve care. She tried to ask about treatment, but Dr. Ellis answered her dryly, reservedly, not bothering to explain. Her words, her concern, her questions, all seemed to him nothing more than annoying noise, and he answered as if her thoughts were of no consequence. All he saw before him was just another patient he didn't think was worth his time and attention. At that moment, Conrad made a choice dictated not by professional obligations, but by the dark, barely realized beliefs he harbored about people like Amina. To him, she was just a problem that could be solved with a simple prod, without bothering to adhere to standards. His cold decision at that moment was the beginning of the tragedy that Amina and her family were about to endure, for he had deliberately turned his back on his medical oath, disregarding life for his own deeply held prejudices. And all the while thoughts flashed through his mind to justify his actions. "They're getting what they deserve," he told himself as he inserted the needle into the girl's skin, knowing the consequences of doing so could be dangerous. It was his quiet act of contempt, his own way of showing that he was above and stronger than those who asked for his help. In that moment, being a doctor lost its meaning, and he became what he was on the inside, a man untrustworthy despite his white coat. Dr. Conrad Ellis stood at the medicine cabinet where the drugs needed for treatment were stored, his gaze slowly sliding over the shelves filled with vials, syringes, and boxes of medication. Each one had clearly labeled labels, prescribed dosages, and instructions for use. But this time, he wasn't looking for the right medicine. He wasn't reading the recommendations or checking the prescriptions he usually followed. The only thing on his mind was to finish this appointment as soon as possible and not waste time with a patient he didn't think deserved to be held to the same standards. He knew that the girl had a peculiar condition that required caution and careful attention. The medical chart carelessly left on the table detailed the diagnosis and prescriptions. The chart listed a medication suitable for her condition, but Conrad glanced at the name and sighed irritably. He wasn't in the mood to waste time looking for the right drug. "Anything will work for her," he mentally said to himself, grinning. "Why waste energy on someone who won't appreciate it anyway?" It was a manifestation of his silent contempt, of the secret indifference he carefully concealed behind the mask of professionalism. He noticed another drug on the shelf that was different from the one prescribed, but he knew it wasn't safe to use without a prescription. It wasn't intended for her diagnosis. Its effects were more potent and could cause serious adverse reactions, especially in a child with a weakened body. Conrad knew this choice was risky, but it didn't matter to him. To him, Amina was just a shadow, another checkmark on the patient list, and her life didn't seem valuable enough for him to follow instructions. At that moment, his bias reached its highest point. He didn't just ignore the recommendations, he deliberately chose to go against them, as if he wanted to punish her for the very fact of her existence. His decision was like a silent act of revenge, made without words, but imbued with a bitter hatred hidden behind the usual equanimity. He knew that the right choice was before him, but he had deliberately turned his back on it, choosing a drug that could lead to tragic consequences. When he returned to the girl with the syringe in his hands, Amina's mother noticed his careless attitude and asked warily, "Are you sure this is what she needs? I haven't seen this drug before." There was concern in her voice, but Conrad answered dryly and aloofly, not even bothering to look at her. "I'm a doctor. Believe me, I know what I'm doing." His words sounded firm, but there wasn't an ounce of comfort or concern in them. He said them as if he were rebuking her for worrying, for daring to question his judgment. Amina's mother wanted to add something, but she was alarmed by the icy, prickly note in his voice, and she kept silent, not wanting to provoke the doctor. She saw his hand moving slowly and precisely, and decided to trust his experience, though her heart was gripped by an inexplicable sense of uneasiness. Her instinct told her that something was wrong, but she suppressed these feelings, believing that she had no right to interfere with his work. Conrad, holding the syringe, froze for a moment, realizing what he was doing. But instead of stopping to consider the consequences, he chuckled inwardly, feeling a quiet satisfaction in his power over the situation. He liked knowing that he held in his hands the fate of a patient whose life depended on his decisions, and he felt it with a peculiarly grim pleasure. It seemed to him that he was asserting his superiority when he did what he wanted, without regard for regulations, standards, or even the possible risks to the girl's life. He inserted the needle into her arm with mechanical precision, and at that moment something inside him hardened, as if his soul had finally closed to sympathy and empathy. As the drug began to permeate her bloodstream, he showed not an ounce of involvement. His gaze remained cold, devoid of warmth, as if he was giving this injection not to a person, but to an empty shell. Amina flinched in pain, but didn't utter a sound, clenching her teeth. She was used to injections, but something was different this time. A searing pain began to spread through her body, and her face turned pale. Conrad silently removed the syringe and tossed it into the container for used instruments, not bothering to look at the girl. There was not a single thought in his mind about the consequences, not the slightest concern for how she was feeling. He answered the mother's questions in short, irritated sentences, waving her away like a pesky fly, and left the office as soon as he had finished the procedure. But for Amina, it was just beginning. She felt her heart start to beat faster, her breathing becoming harsh and heavy. Her eyes dimmed, and the room began to seem like a blurred maze of shadows. Her mother, noticing that something was wrong, ran over to her, taking her hand, but the girl was already barely able to stand. The heaviness and weakness began to consume her, and she looked up with an effort to see her mother's face contorted with panic. When the mother realized something was wrong, she rushed to call for help. The nurses heard her scream and rushed into the room to try to help her, but the symptoms were increasing too quickly. Their professional experience told them that the situation was critical, but none of them could understand what had caused such a sudden deterioration. Only Conrad Ellis knew that his decision not to follow the prescription was the cause of the disaster, but he was already far away, out of range, as if intentionally leaving the girl alone with the consequences of his choice. Every second felt like an eternity, and the mother, standing at her daughter's bedside, tried to hold back her tears, praying that help would arrive in time. She didn't know that behind the doctor's decision was bias, hatred, and cold indifference. She didn't realize that the person she trusted with her child's health had deliberately jeopardized her life. This act, his refusal to follow the prescription, his indifference to her pain, was a quiet but devastating tragedy, a manifestation of the darkness behind the white coat and medical instruments. When Conrad Ellis plunged the needle into Amina's arm, it was as if time stood still. A strange, elusive silence filled the room around them. Everything seemed slow and tense in that moment, as if the very air between them had taken on an ominous density. Conrad acted mechanically, his face expressing neither alarm nor doubt, only a cold concentration devoid of any humanity. In his hands was a syringe filled with an inappropriate drug, a drug that could have been fatal to the child. But he didn't think about that. All he cared about was that this visit was over, that this unnecessary patient was left behind. Amina's mother stood nearby, anxiously watching his every move, but her fears were shattered by the wall of indifference that stood between her and this doctor. She noticed that his actions were somehow aloof, as if he avoided even looking in her direction, unwilling to acknowledge her presence. Her mind was still spinning about the drug he had used, but she suppressed her anxiety, believing that a professional with the authority of a doctor would not violate medical orders. Her mind sought solace in the trust in the white coat, in the assurance that every medical professional in her husband's clinic was committed to the Hippocratic Oath. But a different feeling raged inside Conrad, a feeling of superiority, a deafening satisfaction that he could do as he wished, that his actions would go unpunished, that his power over the bodies and lives of patients allowed him to choose whom to help and whom to help with barely perceptible contempt. He knew that Amina's mother trusted him, that she saw him as a man who could help, but that fact only added to his quiet, gloating joy. She had not suspected that this man holding the syringe had deliberately retreated from professional duty. When the needle pierced the girl's skin, Amina shuddered, but withstood the pain, clenching her teeth. Immediately after the injection, however, she felt a strange warmth spreading through her arm, gradually turning into a burning, tingling sensation that became more and more unbearable with each passing second. For a moment, her hand felt as if it didn't belong to her anymore. Her muscles tensed, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with fear, a fear she couldn't put into words because she didn't know what was happening to her. Conrad, removing the syringe, barely gave her a glance. He had no interest in how the girl reacted to the injection, did not stop to observe her condition, did not try to explain to the mother why he had chosen this particular drug. For him, it was just routine. But in his mind, it also became a kind of internal act of revenge, a fictional compensation for grievances he had nurtured for years. His contempt for certain patients, for their skin color, for their requests and concerns was quiet but all-consuming. With each passing second, Amina felt her body refuse to obey. Her breathing became ragged, and her heart pounded with such force that the thudding sound echoed in her ears, blocking out all the sounds around her. She felt herself slowly sinking into a sticky, suffocating fear as her muscles began to clench and her eyes clouded with tears. Her mother, finally realizing something had gone wrong, glanced at the doctor in horror, but Conrad only threw it briefly and coldly. "It's just an adverse reaction. It happens." He didn't bother to explain more, his words sounding like an excuse, as if he were trying to end this conversation and leave the office as quickly as possible, as if the scene in front of him didn't matter. But for Amina's mother, it was a wake-up call. She pulled the girl against her, feeling her body weaken, her lips pale and her skin cool and moist. Her heart began to beat in time with her daughter's, and she could no longer ignore the alarm signals her mind was sending her. She turned to the doctor and summoned all her willpower to demand an explanation, but Conrad only waved it away, frowning, saying that it was temporary and would go away. His indifference was striking and intimidating. It wasn't just a refusal to help, it was as if he were saying, "I don't consider her life important." He slowly put down his instruments, acting with a demonstrative calmness that seemed particularly sinister, and left the office without even bothering to check on the girl's condition. A look of satisfaction flashed in his eyes. He had done his job, and it was his choice, his power that no one could take away. His whole appearance said, "I don't care." Left alone with her daughter, the mother realized that the situation was critical. Amina could barely stand on her feet. Her gaze was blank and detached, as if an invisible barrier had already formed between them. She couldn't understand what exactly the doctor had done, but she knew it shouldn't have happened. At first, she tried to wake her by calling her name, and then, in desperation, she ran to call for help. Her voice echoed down the corridor, an alarm that filled the hospital with a tense atmosphere. The room filled with people again. Nurses and other doctors quickly surrounded Amina, her condition worsening by the minute, and no one could understand why the drug that was supposed to help had suddenly turned into poison. Her mother watched in horror as the life left her daughter, seeing her pale face in which all vitality seemed to have disappeared. and only Dr. Conrad Ellis knew that this over-the-counter injection was his conscious decision, a decision that poisoned the girl's body and possibly took away her future. But he walked away as if he'd never been here, like a shadow, leaving a trail of destruction behind him. As soon as Dr. Conrad Ellis left the office, the atmosphere around Amina and her mother changed. The simple room where the girl had been receiving medical care suddenly seemed cramped and frightening. With every minute, with every breath, Amina's face grew paler and her movements more sluggish, as if something in her body was resisting the foreign substance, trying to stop the invisible threat. But time passed, and the girl's strength was fading. At first, her mother couldn't believe her eyes. Her mind denied the possibility that a shot that seemed so ordinary could cause so much suffering. Amina sat on the edge of the couch with her head down, her eyes half closed, struggling to stay conscious. There were drops of cold sweat on her forehead, and her face, previously pink and lively, was now white as chalk, covered with a strange shadow of fatigue. Her small hands trembled, and she instinctively reached for her mother, trying to find some support in this unknown and frightening sensation that was gripping her body. Her mother noticed how her fingers clenched into fists, how her chest began to erupt into low, barely audible moans. They weren't just sounds of pain, they were signals that something inside her was broken, that something had entered her body and was destroying her from the inside out. She tried to breathe deeply, as if trying to find some relief in the rush of air. But with each breath, her chest constricted more and more, as if an invisible, suffocating thread was wrapped around her heart. Feeling her trembling, her mother put her hand on her shoulder in alarm, and at that moment, she felt the heat rising from her daughter's body, her skin becoming hot and clammy. It wasn't just a reaction to the injection, it was a fever, growing with every second. Panic began to overwhelm the mother, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe it was only a temporary reaction, but her instincts told her that something terrible and irreversible was happening to her daughter. She looked at Amina and noticed how her eyes had grown dull, as if they were shrouded in a thin veil. Her breathing became ragged, and each exhalation seemed like an effort, as if she had to struggle for each breath. She grasped for air, her lips turning slightly blue, and her mother noticed her hands weaken and begin to slide to the edge of the couch. The girl's fingers, which a moment ago had been tightly clenched, were now trembling, and her gaze was fixed on one point, as if she were losing touch with reality. At this point, the mother realized she had no more time to wait. She called for help, and the nurses, hearing her cries, soon filled the room. When the first nurse entered, she immediately noticed that something was wrong with the girl. Her whitened face and shortness of breath indicated that her body was not coping with the strain. Not yet knowing the whole story and not realizing what had happened, she rushed to the girl, trying to measure her pulse and assess her condition. "What happened?" one of the nurses asked, trying to support the girl and feel her pulse. I don't know," the mother, barely holding back tears, tried to explain. "She got sick right after the injection. She started to lose her strength. She can't breathe properly." Her voice shook, but she spoke clearly, trying to make sure her words were heard and understood. She desperately hoped that someone could help, that someone would explain what was happening to her daughter, but Amina seemed to keep drifting away. Her skin grew increasingly cold, her hands lost sensation, and she could barely keep conscious. When the nurse put her hand on her wrist to measure her pulse, she noticed that her pulse was too weak and fast, like a person in a state of panic or fear. She tried to ask her some questions, but the girl could hardly answer. Her lips moved slowly as if she was underwater, and her voice was lost somewhere in the depths. The doctor, who had been summoned immediately, entered the office with a concerned expression on his face. Noting that the girl's condition was of grave concern, he glanced at the medical records but found nothing to explain the sudden deterioration. As he examined Amina, his concern grew. Her symptoms did not fit her diagnosis. Her body's reaction was strange and unusual. He asked her a few questions, and her answers, though brief, outlined a situation in which everything pointed to one thing. Something had gone terribly wrong after the injection. He took the girl's hand, trying to feel her pulse again, and noticed the cold shiver running through her body. His face expressed concern, and he cast a quick glance at the nurses, letting them know that this was a serious matter and that they needed to act immediately. He suspected that the wrong drug had been administered, but he didn't know why. The instructions attached to the medical chart prescribed a different drug, and when he realized this, he frowned, realizing that someone had intentionally or mistakenly injected the girl with a different drug. When her mother heard these words, her heart trembled. Her thoughts went back to Conrad Ellis, to his cold, detached look, to the hard, cold words with which he had answered her questions. She remembered his indifference, and a shiver ran through her body as she realized that he had probably done it deliberately, that his decision had been conscious. But this realization was useless for the girl, who continued to fight for every breath. The doctor, sensing the seriousness of the situation, ordered to rush her to the intensive care unit to prevent possible complications, but his facial expression betrayed doubt. He was not sure they would make it in time. The mother, seeing her daughter being taken away on a stretcher, could not hide her tears. Her heart clenched with pain, with horror, with a feeling of helplessness before this inexplicable and cruel decision of the person she had trusted. Each step toward the recovery room echoed in her soul, as if each sound was a symbol of her daughter slipping further into the shadows from which no one could possibly save her. As Amina was carried on a stretcher down the hospital corridor to the intensive care unit, anxious doctors and nurses began to gather around her. The whole hospital seemed to come alive, mobilizing all its forces to save one child. The hospital itself, with its cold white walls and bright neon lights, ceased for a moment to be a place of calm routine. Every room, every turn seemed filled with an undercurrent of anxiety. The faces of the employees were serious, focused, and in every step and movement, you could feel the tension as they struggled against time. When the girl was placed on the bed in the intensive care unit, a whole team of doctors immediately gathered around her. In the room, only the command of the chief physician was heard, who was clearly giving orders, restraining his own excitement. The nurses and junior doctors silently and quickly obeyed his orders, bringing equipment, drugs, and putting IVs. Their faces were frowning, their gazes full of concentration, because it was clear to everyone. The child's condition was critical, and there was no telling how far the consequences of that injection had gone. They ran several tests, taking her blood pressure and pulse, monitoring her breathing, but every parameter produced alarming results. Her heart rhythm was irregular, racing too fast and then faltering, as if her body didn't know how to react to a drug that her body perceived as poison. The girl's face was pale, her eyes were closed, and her body lay lifeless, and everyone in the room realized that this case required the utmost attention. The chief physician, Dr. Carter, a man with many years of experience in the intensive care unit, tried to remain calm, although anxiety was building inside him. He realized that the injection given to Amina was not just a mistake, it was a serious breach, fraught with grave consequences. He quickly reviewed her chart and discovered that the girl had been prescribed a completely different drug that took into account her peculiarities and condition. It was now clear to him that a serious mistake had been made and someone had knowingly or unknowingly put her at risk. His mind tried to analyze the situation, to find the culprit, but now the main thing was to save the girl. "Get the adrenaline ready," he commanded, and the nurse immediately rushed to the medicine cabinet, pulling out the right syringe. Her body couldn't take it. An anaphylactic reaction had begun. As the nurse administered adrenaline to Amina, those in the room held their breath as they watched the girl breathe a little more deeply, but her condition remained extremely unstable. Each improvement was barely perceptible and was replaced by a new bout of weakness. Her mother, standing at the threshold of the room, did not move away a step, watching every movement of the doctors, every action. Her eyes were filled with despair and fear, and every time one of the doctors looked in her direction, they felt her silent cry for help, her silent plea to save her child. Dr. Carter looked at Amina's chart again, once more checking all the appointments. He felt that his instincts were telling him something important, but he couldn't understand why the girl was in this condition. Why had the wrong drug been administered? Why hadn't the doctor who had administered it followed clear instructions? Carter glanced at the nurse standing next to him and asked quietly, "Who was her doctor at her appointment?" The nurse hesitated for a moment, as if afraid to answer, but then, meeting his serious gaze, she mumbled, "Dr. Ellis, sir." He gave her an injection before she started having these symptoms. Dr. Ellis's name echoed in Carter's head, and he instantly remembered the doctor, cold, reserved, who preferred to avoid excessive communication with his colleagues. Ellis was a professional, but he had always had an air of mystery and distrust about him. Many nurses had already noticed his strange attitude towards some patients, and Dr. Carter suddenly realized that Conrad Ellis could be the cause of this tragedy. He clenched his teeth, trying to hide the resentment that was beginning to boil in his soul. It wasn't time for a trial yet. The most important thing now was to save the girl. He ordered the nurse to set up additional drips and began to prepare a plan of action, trying to figure out how to neutralize the effects of the drug, which was obviously not suitable for Amina. As the situation became heated, another nurse entered the ICU, quickly informing them that the girl's father, James Bryant, the owner of the clinic, had just arrived and was on his way to see them. The staff exchanged anxious glances. They all knew that James was not only their boss, but also a strict and principled man, for whom taking care of patients was not just a duty, but a moral obligation. The news that his own daughter was in such a situation had left the staff in a silent stupor. A moment later, the door to the room swung open, and James, with a pale face and eyes full of anxiety, stepped inside. He glanced at Amina lying in the hospital bed, and his heart clenched with pain. For the first time in a long time, he felt helpless and crushed, seeing his little girl struggling to live. He didn't need words to realize that the situation was critical. Carter walked over to him, gently touching his shoulder and trying to briefly explain the situation. James listened to him with clenched fists, and his face, normally composed and unruffled, contorted with bitterness and pain. "Who injected her?" His voice was quiet, but there was an undercurrent of resentment, an almost suppressed rage. Carter lowered his gaze, and in a subdued tone said, "Dr. Conrad Ellis." The name, spoken in the silence, seemed to envelop the room with a chill. James had known Dr. Ellis, known his professional skills, but now there was a doubt in his mind. Could this man he trusted with his hospital have deliberately neglected his daughter? He couldn't imagine how this doctor, to whom he had given his job, could let his family down like that, harm his child. He glanced at Carter and said quietly, "I want to know what happened, clearly, minute by minute. How and why he decided to give her the wrong shot." His gaze became hard, icy, determined to know the truth, to understand what had caused this tragedy. Carter nodded and went back to his treatment, and James remained at his daughter's bedside, desperately clinging to the hope that the efforts of the medical team would be stronger than the forces that were tearing her health apart. Now, the whole hospital seemed to freeze, as if the very atmosphere within the walls had become dark and oppressive. The medical staff acted with redoubled vigor and caution, realizing that they had no right to make a mistake. Everyone in the intensive care unit knew that not just the girl's life was at stake, the honor of their hospital was at stake. A trust that could be destroyed by one rash, cruel decision. With every breath and every beat of the girl's heart, their own hearts quickened and pounded in time with her breathing. There was a tense silence in the silence of the office of James Bryant, the owner of the hospital. He stood at the window, staring into the void, his face frozen, as if carved from stone. The thoughts in his head were rushing around like dark clouds on the horizon, unable to find peace. The thudding of his own heart still echoed in his ears, and it was as if he could feel her faint pulse beating in his chest, making him realize the gravity of what had happened. He wasn't just a father. He was the owner of this institution, which he had created with the conviction that every patient, regardless of their position or background, should receive equal and quality care. But his trust, his faith in his team had been shaken. Something dark and cruel had happened within those walls, and he could not stay away. Leaving his daughter in the care of the best specialists, James left the room and headed toward the administrative wing of the hospital. His steps were firm, resolute, and every staff member he passed could feel the tension radiating from him with bated breath. He needed to answer the ultimate question: how and why did this happen? A feeling was growing in his chest that this was not a simple misunderstanding or mistake. Something dark and unfair hung over their family, and he was going to get to the bottom of it. As the chief physicians and administrators gathered in the conference room, James slowly looked around at them. Sitting around the table were people who had known him for years, who had helped build this hospital, with whom he had shared not only work but also personal moments of his life. And now they were with him, but each felt the unbearable weight of this gathering. James gave them a sharp, cold look that made them uncomfortable. He had always been a man of fairness and honesty, but now there was an icy anger in him that no one had ever seen before. "My daughter almost died in this hospital today," he began in a quiet but tense voice. "My daughter, who should have been given the best care possible, was not given the treatment she was prescribed. Will one of you explain to me how this could have happened?" He did not raise his voice, but his words were an ironclad demand for the truth. There was an awkward silence in the room. Everyone in the room was trying to find answers, but no one knew where to start. The medics' gazes slid downward, no one daring to speak. James waited, his eyes drilling into each of them, until finally, one of the doctors, Dr. Carter, looked up. "We found out that Dr. Conrad Ellis was the prescriber," he began cautiously, feeling the tension in the room rise. He had decided to administer the injection without proper adherence and hadn't checked the patient's chart. James squinted, his face pale. The name Conrad Ellis stirred in him a deep sense of resentment and betrayal. It was the same doctor to whom he had once entrusted a place on his team, hoping that he would serve the cause as faithfully as he had. But now, hearing his name in connection with this terrible incident, James felt a fire ignite inside him. "Dr. Ellis," he said slowly, as if tasting the words, full of bitterness and resentment. "Are you saying that this man deliberately ignored instructions?" "We don't know yet if it was intentional," Carter explained hastily, but his words did nothing to quell the anger simmering in James. "But there is evidence that he didn't check the prescription and administered an injection that wasn't intended for your daughter's condition." James was silent, pondering what he had heard, and the anger inside him grew brighter and brighter, turning into a quiet but deadly determination to find the truth. He realized that his daughter had suffered at the hands of someone he had hired, someone he had allowed into this institution. The sense of betrayal was like a heavy stone in his chest, and now he knew what he had to do. "I want to see Conrad Ellis." His voice was clear and unyielding. immediately. The people present looked at each other in silence. Everyone realized that this was going to be a difficult conversation, and some already foresaw how it might end. They informed Dr. Ellis that the owner of the clinic wished to see him, and soon he appeared at the door of the conference room. His face was as impenetrable as ever, and his eyes were cold and detached, as if what had happened had only touched him in passing. James slowly rose from the table and stood in front of Ellis, his gaze full of burning rage. "Dr. Ellis," he began, his voice cold and threatening, "explain to me how you allowed this to happen. Why did you choose to ignore the regulations?" Conrad flinched slightly, but he didn't show it. He stood still, his hands folded behind his back, and his face kept a calm expression. "Minus Mr. Bryant, I've made my professional judgment. In cases like this, patients sometimes have an adverse reaction." His voice was flat, almost emotionless. "I didn't find it necessary to follow standard instructions." Conrad's words, spoken with icy indifference, were like a knife to James's heart. He realized that, to this man, his daughter was just a patient, an ordinary case that deserved no special attention. All the restraint, all the strictness he had maintained in his life fell away when he realized that he was facing a man who showed no sympathy whatsoever. "Have you made up your mind?" His voice shook with restrained anger. "That was my daughter, Dr. Ellis. A child who needed help and attention, not your indifference and cold calculation. You didn't just ignore instructions. You jeopardized her life." Conrad only shrugged, his gaze calm, devoid of regret. He felt no guilt, no sense that his actions should be justified. To him, it was just a routine incident that didn't deserve his full attention, and he saw no reason to change his attitude. James felt the rage building in him, his hands clenching into fists. He wanted to scream, to spew out everything that was in his heart, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. Instead, he decided to do things differently, coldly, and deliberately. "As of today, you are suspended," he said, looking straight into Conrad's eyes. "Your position in this hospital was given to you on the basis of trust, but you have betrayed that trust. I will not tolerate any employee who disregards the lives of patients, especially when my child's life is at stake." Conrad didn't answer. He just nodded, keeping the same impassive expression on his face, and walked out of the conference room. His footsteps, measured and confident, disappeared out the door, leaving behind an icy cold sensation, a reminder that not all people in white coats are worthy of wearing this symbol of salvation. James stared after him, a sense of determination building in his soul. He knew that he would pursue this case to the end, that he would not stop until he had all the details and found a way to protect the other patients from those who had dared to disregard their lives. That night, the hospital fell into an oppressive silence. Everyone knew that something terrible had happened to the owner's daughter, but the details remained unknown. But the rumors spread quickly through the corridors, and every doctor, every nurse felt the tension hanging in the air, as if the hospital itself were covered with an invisible net, growing denser and more unbearable by the hour. At the center of this net was Dr. Conrad Ellis, a physician now regarded by many with growing suspicion. James Bryant stood in his office, staring thoughtfully at a desk littered with documents and medical reports. On one of the folders was his daughter's medical records, which were clearly labeled with the prescriptions and medication appropriate for her condition. And now he realized that Conrad had violated every possible instruction by putting her in danger. James saw Ellis's cold, indifferent face again and again, and he could feel the resentment boiling up in him. He knew he had to get to the bottom of what had happened, and he wouldn't rest until he got justice. He called Dr. Carter and some of the members of the medical team who had been present when Amina had been treated. He wanted to know every nuance, every detail that might shed light on Ellis's actions. Dr. Carter and the nurses stepped into the office, looking at each other cautiously, knowing that this was going to be a difficult conversation. "Tell me everything." James's voice was muffled but determined. "How exactly did it happen that my daughter received an injection that wasn't meant for her condition?" Carter sighed, and after a short pause, choosing his words carefully, began to explain. He described how Conrad Ellis had acted with indifference, not bothering to check the prescription, how he had used a drug that wasn't listed in the prescription. Carter described how a shadow of irritation came over Conrad's eyes, as if Amina were just a nuisance, an annoying chore he wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. Every word Carter said was like a knife stabbing into James's heart. He realized that his daughter had been the victim not only of medical negligence, but also of someone's inner hatred, a bias that had turned deadly that day. Carter also mentioned that before leaving, Conrad remained completely calm. He was not bothered by his mother's questions or her concerns. On the contrary, he was cold, as if he realized that his actions would go unpunished. James listened as if in slow motion. The thought pulsed through his mind that his daughter had been the target of racist indifference, the kind of blatant, shameless indifference that only a person who was sure of his superiority could possess. Carter continued, describing how the other staff members discovered Amina's deteriorating condition and rushed to her aid. They didn't understand what could have caused such severe symptoms, but upon analysis, they quickly realized that the drug administered was completely inappropriate. It was a powerful drug, not intended for children, and could cause serious adverse reactions, especially in a child with Amina's condition. James was silent, digesting what he had heard. He knew that people of different ethnicities and backgrounds came to this institution, and he had always prided himself on the fact that the doors were open to everyone equally, that his hospital was a symbol of equality. But now that equality was shattered, as if someone had cast a shadow over him, distorting everything he believed in. The culprit was the doctor he trusted. The man who was supposed to provide care and help had betrayed that trust and jeopardized a child's life in cold blood, letting his preconceived beliefs override his professional ethics. He clenched his fists, realizing that to Ellis, Amina was probably nothing more than an outsider, an other. It was the same latent hatred with which he greeted every patient whose roots and culture differed from his own. James realized that his daughter was a victim of this quiet but deadly bias, and that Conrad may have deliberately chosen an inappropriate drug, hoping that that girl would simply walk away with minimal attention. When Carter finished, James looked around at everyone in the office. He saw the shame, regret, and realization in their eyes that Conrad had betrayed not only the hospital, but all of them. It was the moment of truth, the moment when it became clear that Amina had suffered because of the biased choice of the man who was supposed to protect her health. A sense of oppressive responsibility hung in the air as James rose from the table and looked directly at Dr. Carter. "We can't just leave it at that," he said in a subdued voice that hid his inner rage. This man not only violated medical guidelines, but he showed that some people's lives are less valuable to him than others. I will not stop until Conrad Ellis is held accountable for his actions. He knew that this case would expose all the weaknesses in their system, that this incident would cast a shadow not only on him as the owner, but on the hospital itself. He had to investigate, to find out how it could have happened that one of his doctors had acted so cruelly, disregarding his oath as a doctor, filling his work with latent hatred. James stayed in the office long after Carter and his team had left. A determination was growing inside him to conduct an investigation where there would be no room for secrecy. This incident, he would make an example that bias and discrimination could not be hidden behind a white coat. The next day, James Bryant, who had barely had time to rest after a sleepless night, spent several more hours at Amina's bedside, watching as the nurses checked her condition and administered the necessary medications. The girl's condition remained serious, and every minute of waiting was torture. An unwavering desire burned in his soul to understand how and why this had happened. Every thought that flashed through his mind was overlaid with a fierce anger directed at the person behind his daughter's suffering, Dr. Conrad Ellis. James waited while the staff announced that Ellis had arrived for a conversation. As soon as he got the news, he immediately went to the conference room where he had made the appointment, not hiding his anger and rage. His steps through the empty corridors of the hospital were heavy and determined, and even those on the staff who did not know about the tragedy could feel the tension and repressed anger radiating from him like the electrical voltage before a thunderstorm. When he entered the room, Dr. Conrad Ellis was already waiting for him, standing by the table with an expression on his face as if he had been summoned for a simple report. There was not the slightest trace of remorse or concern on his face. On the contrary, there was a cold, indifferent look in his eyes, as if he were in complete control of the situation. But to James, that look was even more disgusting. The doctor who had caused his daughter to lie between life and death stood before him as if nothing significant had happened. At that moment, James felt the rage building in his chest, turning into an almost unbearable desire to make him answer for every moment of pain his daughter had experienced. "Dr. Ellis," James began, his voice a muffled threat, "explain to me how it happened that my daughter was given an injection that almost killed her." Conrad met his gaze but remained indifferent. His face didn't flinch, and he didn't even try to soften his expression. This was just a standard work case for him, and he wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. "I did what I thought was appropriate as part of a professional decision," he replied with restraint. "In situations like this, a doctor can make a decision without relying on every little detail in the chart. I thought the drug was right for the patient, and that was enough." His words made James's insides twist. He made an effort not to lash out at Ellis right there in the conference room. The doctor's every word seemed imbued with icy disdain, as if his daughter's life was nothing more than a statistic in a report. Bryant squinted his eyes, holding back his rage, but his voice rang with restrained emotion. "Do you think you could just ignore the prescriptions prescribed for her treatment? She was your responsibility. How could you let this happen?" He could barely contain his anger, his fingers clenched into fists, white with tension. Ellis shrugged, maintaining the same indifferent tone that made the situation even more heated. "Patients like your daughter," he began, and for a moment something dark and contemptuous flickered in his eyes, barely perceptible but enough for James to notice. "Don't always require special attention. She had symptoms, but I found it possible to do with less formal methods. I'm a doctor, and I have the right to make the decisions that seem best to me." This "patients like your daughter" sounded like a slap in the face, like an open and shameless admission of prejudice hidden behind formal language. For James, it was the last straw. He stepped forward, so close that his face almost touched Ellis's. His eyes burned with a cold rage he couldn't and wouldn't contain. "Do you realize what you're saying?" James said it with icy calm, but every muscle in his body was tense as a taut string. "You have allowed yourself to treat my daughter with contempt. You deliberately ignored her condition, her medical evidence, because you thought she didn't deserve your attention? Did you jeopardize her life simply because she didn't fit your narrow, prejudiced view?" Ellis leaned back, but kept his composure, his face impassive, as if they were just words that didn't concern him personally. "In our profession, sometimes we have to make hard choices," he said, and a faint grin flickered across his face. "I did what I thought was right. My decisions are dictated by experience and intuition. Sometimes some patients need less attention to help those who really need it. The words were unbearable to James. A loud, judgmental voice echoed in his head, and his hands involuntarily clenched even tighter. To this man, his daughter, his little girl, was just one of those people who Ellis didn't think deserved to be taken care of. He felt as if he were standing across from an enemy, a man whose beliefs were an affront to everything he believed in. This doctor, to whom he had entrusted his patients, had disregarded his oath, jeopardizing the life of a child, his child. "You say it was your choice," James said quietly, his voice shaking with anger but surprisingly restrained. "Then let me make my choice. From this day forward, you're no longer a doctor in this hospital. I'm suspending you from practice, and believe me, I will do my best to end your career here and now." Conrad Ellis turned slightly pale, his confidence shaken for the first time, but he continued to maintain a semblance of calm. "You can't just fire me like that," he said, but his voice was no longer so confident. "It could set a precedent, and you'd have to explain yourself." "Believe me, I have plenty of evidence," James said with such cold firmness that no one in the room doubted his intentions. "I'll make sure you can never go near the patient again. My daughter, who almost lost her life, will be your sentence." With those words, James turned and left the conference room, leaving Conrad standing in silence. His heart was still raging with anger, but now he felt he had done the right thing. He had protected not only his daughter, but all the other patients who could have been victimized by this insensitive man. Now that he knew the truth, his next goal was to get justice, which was a duty not only to his daughter, but to everyone who had put their trust in his hospital. In the evening of that day, James Bryant again stood by his daughter's bedside, watching her calm but still faint breathing. Her face lacked the liveliness he had been accustomed to see, and every new glance at her brought him muffled pain. But now that the worst hours were behind him, not only personal experiences, but deeper, more agonizing questions came to his mind. He realized that Amina's case was not an isolated incident that happened because of one doctor. The realization was growing inside him that the problem was much broader and had roots far beyond the walls of this hospital. During his years in medicine, James knew many stories in which bias became an invisible but destructive force. As a hospital owner and former physician, he could not turn a blind eye to the fact that there were patients who received less care simply because of their race, social status, or background. These thoughts persistently ran through his mind, giving him no peace of mind. Now that his daughter was a victim of this invisible system, he felt the need to get to the root of the problem and fight what was poisoning patients' trust in doctors. Early that morning, after assembling his chief medical council, James decided to raise the issue with his colleagues. The conference room was full of physicians and administrators, most of whom saw this hospital as a place free of bias and discrimination. But James knew the reality was much more complex, and his goal was to get an open and honest discussion going. He began by talking about what had happened to Amina, not only as a tragedy, but as a symbol that opened his eyes to problems that had been overlooked by many. There was silence in the room, each doctor listening to him, realizing that the conversation would be difficult but necessary. "We all know," James began, his voice firm and calm, "that our profession demands absolute equality before the life and health of every patient. We have taken an oath that requires us to care for everyone without exception, regardless of their color, ethnicity, age, or social status. Yet in our world, bias and discrimination have permeated the practice of medicine. They permeate our decisions, our diagnoses, and even how much time we are willing to give to a patient." James was silent for a moment, his gaze traveling over everyone present. He could see in the eyes of many of the doctors the realization that they were part of the system, albeit unwittingly. Bias in medicine is not always a conscious choice. Sometimes it is cultural stereotypes, sometimes it is accumulated experience. But most often it is just an invisible shadow behind the facade of professionalism. We've all heard stories, he continued, about how patients of color receive different treatment. There are studies that show that Black patients are less likely to be prescribed painkillers. Their pain is underestimated. Their symptoms are more likely to be ignored. We may think these are problems of other hospitals, other countries, other doctors. But this case today affects us all, and I cannot allow this to continue. The hall remained quiet, but the tension was almost palpable. James continued, delving into statistics and research showing that racial bias is not just an accident, it is a problem deeply embedded in the system. He talked about how these instances affect the confidence of patients, especially those who already feel vulnerable in society. When a person comes for help and receives a cold, indifferent attitude because they are perceived not as a person, but as a member of another race or culture, it destroys faith not only in a particular doctor, but in the entire healthcare system. We have a responsibility to be better, he said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. Each of us has to ask ourselves, how can our own stereotypes and preconceived notions affect the patient? How can every choice we make, every action we take, be the very moment when the patient stops believing that we are here for them? His words resonated with his listeners. Many of them realized that behind the facade of ideals and values of the medical community lay a problem that was rarely spoken about. The practice of medicine was supposed to be the epitome of justice, but sometimes there was an invisible bias within that became a real danger to patients like his daughter. Some of those present, especially the younger doctors, seemed shocked to realize that such things could happen right under their noses and even through them. We can't let another patient suffer because of someone else's prejudice, James said as he continued speaking. I want each of us to be honest with ourselves. I want us to ask ourselves the hard questions, that we fight our own prejudices, our own beliefs that can cloud our vision of the person in front of us. There is no room in our business for division, bias, much less hatred. He announced that the hospital will soon implement mandatory training on bias and racism, including in-depth psychology courses to help doctors recognize and combat their own biases. James also proposed the creation of an equality committee within the hospital to monitor and prevent any bias in patient care. His voice was confident and unwavering, and his gaze was determined to see it through. For James, this incident with Amina was a catalyst for change. He realized that his role as hospital manager was not only to ensure professionalism and quality of care, but also to create a space where every patient felt protected and valued. He realized that he had a long way to go, that he would have to fight deep-seated prejudices that had been ingrained in society for centuries. But he was ready. When his speech was over, the room remained silent for some time, but there was no indifference or protest in that silence. It was a silence of agreement and determination, a silence in which those present realized the importance of change. James left that meeting knowing that they had taken the first step toward change. With each new day spent in the intensive care ward, Amina's condition remained unstable. The whole hospital seemed to freeze, waiting for improvement or even the slightest sign of hope. The medical team did everything they could to stabilize her, but the consequences of the off-label injection were more serious than anyone had anticipated. After the introduction of an inappropriate drug, an acute allergic reaction began in the girl's body, accompanied by a sharp rise in temperature and malfunctioning of the main body systems. The drug, designed for an adult, affected her body like a slow poison, destroying cell by cell, depriving the body of the ability to fight the foreign substance. The doctors managed to stabilize her condition in the first 24 hours, but the internal effects of this treatment remained deep inside, like a hidden threat. Every morning, James Bryant came to her room, sat down beside her, and watched as the girl, usually cheerful and active, now lay under the motionless sheets, her face pale and her breathing weak. Looking at her little body, he could see the effects of the injection manifesting themselves on a physical level. Her skin had become almost transparent, as if all her strength had left her. Her face looked tired and haggard, and her small hands were covered in drip and needle marks. Her eyes, when she opened them briefly, no longer had the bright light that had been her trademark, the symbol of her resilience and strength. Medical examinations showed that the drug had caused serious complications in her cardiovascular system. Her heart was now beating intermittently. Each new beat was difficult to deliver, and doctors feared it would fail if the crisis continued. Her lungs also suffered, and every attempt to take a deep breath was accompanied by a painful cramp. Periodically, she would cough, interrupting her rest, and each attack was so severe that doctors had to sedate her to reduce the strain on her body. But perhaps the most frightening thing was that her nervous system was also affected by the toxic effects of the drug. Sometimes Amina would open her eyes and stare into the void, as if she didn't recognize the people around her. At times, her eyes would cloud over, and her lips would move as if she was trying to say something, but no sound would come out of her throat. These moments tore at the heart of her parents at her bedside. James and his wife saw their little girl losing touch with reality, seeming to drift away from them, drifting to a place where they couldn't reach her. The effects of the injection on her health spread further like an invisible net, poisoning every corner of her body. Her immune system was weakened, and now the doctors were worried that even the slightest infection could prove fatal. She could no longer digest food on her own and had to be hooked up to nutrition through an IV to maintain her strength in any way. Even tiny sips of water caused her pain, and every day her parents watched as their daughter suffered more and more, becoming a shadow of the cheerful child who had recently been running around the house, laughing and enjoying life. One night, while James was on duty at her bedside, Amina suddenly opened her eyes and whispered, struggling to get the words out, "Dad, I'm tired." Her voice was weak and broken, as if every sound hurt her, but her eyes were pleading. James, holding back tears, took her hand, feeling her cold, almost lifeless fingers. "I'm here, sweetheart," he replied, leaning closer, his voice trembling. "You're strong, Amina. We'll get through this, I promise." But in spite of his words, he realized that her strength was waning with each passing day. Her body was exhausted, and all the efforts of the doctors seemed powerless against the invisible enemy that had taken up residence inside her. Each new day brought new symptoms, new complications, and the doctors were beginning to fear that the effects of the injection would be irreversible. Specialists James had recruited from other hospitals also expressed doubts. One of them, a pediatrician with years of experience, told him frankly, "The psychological and physical effects of such an event can stay with her for the rest of her life. Even if we can stabilize her, there is a high risk that she will suffer from heart problems, breathing problems, and even nervous disorders. Your daughter has suffered tremendous damage." Those words were like a hammer blow to James. He knew that Amina's health, her future, her chances for a normal life had been ruined because of someone else's bias, someone else's cold, indifferent decision. He felt that she would be paying for another person's mistakes and hatred for the rest of her life. Every night he prayed that his little girl would survive, that despite the pain, she would be able to stand on her feet again, to laugh and be happy again. But anxiety and anger grew inside him, the realization that even if she survived, her life would never be the same again. Her body and her soul were mutilated within the walls of his own hospital, a place that should have been a symbol of care and safety. Medical malpractice and implicit bias are what left a mark on his daughter's life. And now his mission is not only to bring her back to life, but also to fight to ensure that never again will any child or person suffer at the hands of a doctor who allowed his dark beliefs to override his duty to help. Amina's condition, her unspeakable pain and suffering, deeply affected James Bryant. He realized that he had not only his daughter's life in his hands, but a right to justice that he could not ignore. Remembering the cold, impassive gaze of Conrad Ellis, James realized that such a man, devoid of basic compassion and respect for life, should no longer be at the bedside of patients. He had no right to remain a doctor and continue to work in a system where his decisions could once again become a mortal threat. The next morning, leaving Amina in the care of the most experienced nurses, James contacted the legal department and gathered all the documentation necessary to begin the formal proceedings. He knew that the road to justice would be difficult and long, but he was determined to see it through. For him, this was not just a personal matter, but also a matter of honor and principle. It was his duty to every patient, to every man who trusted doctors, just as he had once trusted Conrad Ellis. He began his first steps by filing a formal complaint with the medical board, describing the case in great detail. Ellis's biased behavior, his refusal to follow orders, his disregard for the patient's life, and the terrible consequences that resulted. He pointed out that the doctor's bias permeating his actions was so obvious that James could not help but question Ellis's professional and moral fitness to practice medicine. The documents also included testimony from doctors and nurses confirming that Ellis ignored instructions and refused to even check the drug before injecting it. The medical board, upon receiving the complaint, immediately realized that the matter was extremely serious. The hospital's reputation, James's high standing, and his influence in the medical community added weight to his every word. A hearing was soon scheduled to consider the ethics of Ellis's behavior as well as the possible legal ramifications. James watched the preparations carefully, reviewing every paper, rereading the testimony over and over, making sure that no one would forget the pain his daughter had gone through. The hearing before the medical board was attended by several lawyers, representatives of the hospital, and doctors who had witnessed the incident. Conrad Ellis appeared in the room with his lawyer, and although his face remained as impassive as before, his tension was evident to all present. He had to answer for his actions to his colleagues and the professional community. James was the first to speak. He spoke with restraint, but his voice was firm and resolute. He presented the case as he himself had experienced it, with pain and disappointment that he could not shake off. James described how his daughter, recently a cheerful child, now lay in a hospital room, exhausted and defenseless because the doctor they trusted had decided her life was less valuable. He accused Ellis of allowing bias and hatred, that these feelings outweighed the Hippocratic oath and duty to the patient. "This man," James said, his voice tingling with restrained anger, "made a conscious decision that jeopardized my daughter's life. He violated every basic principle of our profession, disregarding medical standards to satisfy his own prejudices. He didn't just make a mistake, he willfully refused to do his duty, and an innocent child suffered because of it." When his testimony ended, there was a tense silence in the room. James's every word was like a blow that split the silence. His statement made those present look at the incident not just as a medical error, but as a breach of ethics, as a betrayal of the doctor's oath. The council listened intently, and it was evident from the faces of its members that they realized the seriousness and depth of the accusations. When the turn came to Conrad Ellis, his lawyer tried to explain that there had been a mistake, that the doctor had acted within his discretion. He tried to present the case as complex and controversial, pointing out that in medicine, there is always room for different opinions, for professional choice. But his words could not hide the coldness and indifference with which Ellis stood before the board, as if he did not realize the enormous harm he had done. When he was given the opportunity to say a few words, Ellis looked up and, looking directly at the council members, said, "I did what I thought was right." Sometimes doctors have to rely on intuition, especially if the patient is not a priority case. I don't see any mistake here. These words caused a shock. Confusion was read in everyone present, even his lawyer. Ellis's statement was almost a confession that he really did see his bias as something reasonable and natural. To him, the lives of Amina and others like her really did matter less. It was such a crude and blatant admission that a sense of horror arose in everyone present. The medical council was shocked to the core. Before them stood a man devoid of those moral qualities that were considered the foundation of the medical profession. It was obvious that his actions were unjustifiable. Soon, the decision of the board became clear. Conrad Ellis was stripped of his medical license for gross violation of professional and ethical standards. This decision was not just a punishment. It was a symbol that medicine would not tolerate discrimination and hatred. But that was just the beginning. After the board revoked Ellis's license, James and his lawyers initiated criminal proceedings. They knew that a doctor like Ellis shouldn't get away with simply losing his job. Legal charges included negligence, personal injury, and willful disregard for a patient's life. The case gained widespread public attention, and soon the media was talking about how the medical community had a place for racial discrimination and bias that could cause real harm. Each hearing was an ordeal for Ellis, who now found himself at the center of a scandal, having completely lost the support of the professional community. In the courtroom, surrounded by the press, he still kept his composure, but his inner world was crumbling. He had lost not only his job, but also his right to practice medicine, now branded as a symbol of bias and hate. For James, it was a victory, albeit a bitter one. He knew that, despite the dire consequences for Ellis, his daughter was still fighting for life, and no amount of punishment could bring her back to health. But it was also proof to every patient that there was justice, that bias in medicine would not go unpunished, that the hospital named after him would be a place where everyone was entitled to equal and respectful treatment. When the proceedings were over, James stood in front of the hospital and looked at its facade, realizing that this story would now remain a part of its history, but would also be a reminder to every doctor that serving people requires sincerity, equality, and respect for every life. With litigation winding down and Conrad Ellis losing its license to practice medicine, the hospital and the medical community were on the cusp of change. The Amina Bryant case became a landmark case, attracting not only local media attention, but national attention as well. The problem of bias and negligence uncovered at one of the city's most respected hospitals prompted a review of existing standards and led to deep reflection in the medical community. Every morning, hospital staff would meet eyes in the corridors, discussing what had happened in half-whispers, trying to comprehend how their colleague had so blatantly violated the principles of medical ethics. Many physicians, from nurses to department heads, felt inner shame and embarrassment, realizing that their professional environment was not immune to bias that could destroy lives. The medical community has always been considered a moral and responsible one, but this case proved that even the best professionals can make terrible mistakes, allowing personal biases to cloud professional judgment. the hospital's leadership gathered for an emergency meeting to discuss next steps to not only protect patients from similar situations, but also to restore trust in the institution. James Bryant, Amina's father and the owner of the hospital, attended the meeting, though his role now went beyond just a supervisor. He was a symbol of the pain and betrayal that had occurred within the walls of his own hospital. His presence made everyone feel tense and aware of how tragic what had happened had become for their medical institution. James began the meeting with an address in which he shared his pain, but also expressed his commitment to transforming the hospital, making it stronger than ever. He knew that one tragedy shouldn't be the end, but should be the impetus for improvements that would help prevent this from happening again. "We can't forget what happened to my daughter," he said, his voice calm but full of pain and determination. "But we can do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. We must rethink every aspect of our work to create a system that leaves no room for bias, hatred, or negligence." The meeting lasted several hours, during which various changes in policies and standards were proposed and discussed. One of the first measures proposed was a mandatory training program for all staff, including doctors, nurses, and administrative staff. James insisted that this program include courses on overcoming bias, the psychology of patient communication, and cultural competency training. He wanted every physician to be able to recognize and acknowledge his or her biased attitudes so that he or she could learn to control them and prevent them from influencing medical decisions. In addition, it was decided to establish an ethical oversight committee to monitor each case that requires special attention. This committee, made up of independent physicians and members of the public, would be empowered to conduct its own investigations and advise management on issues related to discrimination and bias. James insisted that committee members have access to each patient's history in order to analyze even the most minor complaints, identifying potential risks. The hospital also implemented a new policy requiring every doctor prescribing medication to a patient to undergo a two-step review by a senior physician or medical consultant. This process avoided careless decisions, such as those that led to Amina's tragedy, and provided an additional level of accountability for each doctor. After the meeting, James Bryant wrote an open letter to the medical community to share his findings from the incident. His letter was published by all major medical publications as well as news portals, and it generated a great deal of publicity. In this letter, James not only told about the incident, but also urged all doctors to introspect, to review their own beliefs and professional standards. He reminded that the work of a doctor does not tolerate bias, that everyone who puts on a white coat must take responsibility for every word and action. "Bias in medicine is a hidden poison that destroys trust," he wrote. "When a person in need of help comes to the hospital, they should feel safe knowing that their health is in the hands of people who are willing to fight for them, no matter who they are, what color their skin is, or their background." His call was heeded. Soon, medical organizations and hospitals across the country began initiating changes. Many institutions began to incorporate mandatory ethics and anti-discrimination training, and some clinics, inspired by James's example, also created physician practice oversight committees. The case has led many professionals to consider how much their personal views can affect their work. Young doctors reading about the incident saw how their profession had been held hostage to one man's bias and the consequences. It seemed that the medical world itself had been forced to recognize that there was still a problem within their ranks that had long been ignored. Amina's case was not just a tragedy for one family. It was an eye-opener for the entire community, showing that medicine is not free from prejudice, that it needs to be cleaned up and reformed to create space for equality and justice. As time passed, James saw his hospital finally begin to take on a new meaning. Plaques appeared on the walls, reminding the staff of the value of each patient, that medical care could not be selective, that the white coat obligated each person to be an advocate for life and health. In the lobby of the hospital, a small plaque was placed in Amina's honor, commemorating the fact that her story was the beginning of a new era for the institution. Now, every patient entering the hospital would see this symbol, and every doctor passing by would be reminded of his or her mission and duty. Amina's story was a lesson to all, a reminder that medicine is first and foremost about compassion, justice, and absolute dedication to the doctor's oath. The Bryant family, who survived a horrific incident, were thrust into the public spotlight. For James and his wife Clara, this period was filled not only with pain and concern for their daughter's life, but also with an enormous responsibility to ensure that her story did not remain a forgotten case, that the world was aware of the destructive power of bias and indifference, especially in an area where life and death are separated only by the thin line of medical judgment. Each day spent at Amina's bedside was a new page in a book of agony, uncertainty, and conflicting emotions. Her body remained weak, and her mental wounds seemed to grow deeper. Despite the best efforts of the doctors, despite the most expensive and skilled care James could afford, their daughter now lived in constant fear of medical procedures. She flinched at every touch from the nurses, her eyes instantly filled with fear at the sight of a white coat. These moments caused unspeakable pain to her parents, who realized that with each such attack, their little girl lived again and again, that terrible day when her life depended on the hands of a soulless doctor. Clara, Amina's mother, took what had happened to their daughter particularly hard. Her heart ached at the thought that her child, innocent and trusting, had become a victim of hatred hidden under a mask of professionalism. She blamed herself for failing to protect Amina, for letting that doctor administer the injection, for trusting the system. Each new outbreak of Amina's deterioration made her agonize. Her heart pounded with anxiety, and often at night she woke up over and over again, imagining that doctor, Conrad Ellis, coldly ignoring her daughter's condition, treating her without the slightest concern or compassion. She saw his face as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, and every day she was overcome with a feeling of rage and helplessness. Amina herself, though a child, was well aware that something terrible had happened to her. Her favorite toys had been forgotten. Her smile had disappeared, giving way to anxiety and fatigue. Sometimes she would grasp her mother's hand, look into her eyes, and quietly ask, "Mommy, why did the doctor hurt me? Did I do something wrong?" These words tore Clara apart, for she knew that it was not her fault, that her daughter was simply a victim of a cruel world in which even those whom one trusted could turn out to be one's enemies. James, despite all his pain, felt that his family could not remain in the role of victims. He realized that the truth about what had happened must be known, that this case was not only a personal tragedy, but also a public problem. He made the decision to fight to the end, not allowing bias and negligence to go unpunished. Together with his wife, he and his wife began contacting lawyers, activists, and representatives of various human rights organizations to draw attention to the issues of racism and bias in the medical field. James's mother, Amina's grandmother, was one of the people who supported their quest for justice. She grew up in an era when racial discrimination was not only prevalent, but deeply embedded in society. She realized that Amina's story was the story of thousands of others who were also victims of prejudice. She told them stories from her past, of how people without support and protection were abused, and how it left a lifelong mark on their souls. Her story strengthened James's resolve to fight for his daughter, and those who might have been in her shoes. A few weeks after the incident, James and Clara were interviewed to share their story and how their family was experiencing the effects of negligence and bias. They talked about the emotions that swept over them the moment they learned that their daughter had suffered because of the doctor's decisions based not on her needs, but on his personal beliefs. James shared his vision of how he, as a hospital owner, intends to change the system, how he will fight to make every patient feel safe. "Our daughter is a victim of bias," James said, his voice full of pain, but also full of determination. "We cannot change the past, but we can do our best to make the future different. Our story is not just a tragedy, it is a call for change. It is a call to every doctor, to every person in the medical system, to remember that they are not just a patient, but a person who needs help." The Bryant family faced an overwhelming response after this interview. People from all over the country began writing them letters, sharing stories of how their relatives or themselves had been victims of discrimination and bias in the medical field. These letters filled their home, creating a sense that Amina's pain was shared by thousands of people, that they were not alone in this struggle. These responses supported them in their time of need and showed them that their fight for justice mattered not only to their family, but to countless others. Clara, realizing that her daughter would never be the same again, took part in the creation of a fund to support victims of bias in medicine. This fund helped families affected by negligence and discrimination by providing them with legal and psychological support. She truly believed that even though they were in personal pain, they should use their story as a means to help others. Meanwhile, James continued his reforms at the hospital, using his family's tragedy as a symbol of change. He not only instituted mandatory anti-discrimination courses, but also pushed for new standards of medical ethics that emphasized respect for every patient. His goal was not only for his hospital to become the best, but for other institutions to follow suit. He felt this was his personal mission, a mission that, despite the pain and loss, gave his life new meaning. Every evening, when James returned home to his wife and daughter, he would tell Clara how their efforts were progressing, how the medical community was responding to the call for change. These conversations helped them both deal with the pain, turning it into hope. Deep down, they knew that Amina would never be able to go back to her old life, but they also knew that her story would be an important step toward ensuring that no one else would have to go through a similar tragedy. All that was now left for their family was the belief that their fight for justice would bring results. As the story of Amina and her family spread across the country, it became a cause for serious conversation in medical circles and beyond. More and more physicians, healthcare providers, and administrators realized that the case at James Bryant Hospital was not just a tragedy for one family, but a wake-up call for the entire healthcare system and society. Meetings and conferences on medical ethics and anti-discrimination began to be held across the country. In meeting rooms and on the pages of journals, the debate raged that bias and discrimination are not just social problems, but also serious medical risks. Without planning it, James found himself as one of the leaders of this movement. In his speeches, he appealed to his colleagues, to politicians, and to the public to realize how deep and dangerous bias in medicine is. He emphasized that bias is not just personal beliefs or cultural stereotypes, but a disease that can eat away at a system from the inside, like a hidden infection that harms every patient, undermines public trust in doctors, and destroys the principle of equality in healthcare. Medicine, James said at one of the meetings, is a profession based on respect for life and equality before disease. Everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, or social status, has a right to help. But if we allow bias to creep into our work, if we allow our internal stereotypes to become the filter through which we view patients, we betray our profession. He cited the tragic case of his daughter, explaining how one doctor's bias had brought an innocent child to the brink of life and death. Her suffering was not the result of a medical error, but a conscious decision based on personal bias. This was the danger. When bias masquerades as medical choice, it becomes an invisible threat that can haunt patients even in places where they should feel completely safe. Many doctors listening to his words recalled their own moments of weakness when they might have been biased against a patient. They realized that even a brief moment of judgment or misjudgment could cost someone their health or life. As they reflected on their attitudes and decisions, the physicians began to notice the hidden biases that may have slipped into their practice and realized that fighting bias was more than just rejecting stereotypes. One consequence of the discussion of the importance of combating bias has been the introduction of new training standards for health professionals. Universities and medical colleges have begun to incorporate anti-discrimination and cultural competency courses into their curricula. Students, future physicians, began to learn to see the patient as an individual with their own unique experiences and needs, rather than just a case or a set of symptoms. Teachers explained the importance of recognizing and actively challenging their biases to prevent personal beliefs and stereotypes from influencing diagnosis and treatment. James often said that bias in medicine is a systemic problem and that solving it requires a collective effort. He emphasized that physicians need to work together in unity, creating a culture in which everyone feels responsible for upholding the principles of fairness and respect. In each of his speeches, he encouraged colleagues to be self-reflective and honest with themselves. Medicine requires from us not only professional knowledge, but also deep empathy, he said. We must be able to see the world through the eyes of our patients, to understand their fears, their pain, and their hopes. We cannot afford to remain blind to their experiences just because they are different from us. If we cannot overcome our preconceived beliefs, how can we fight the disease? Over time, the movement against discrimination and bias in medicine began to gain support at the national level. James met with representatives of the Ministry of Health and proposed a series of reforms to improve standards of medical practice. Among the measures proposed were regular discrimination and ethics screenings and mandatory participation by physicians in self-development and cultural competency training programs. James and his allies knew that the road to systemic change would be a long one, but were determined to keep fighting. Many clinics began implementing so-called double-checking systems, a new approach to medical decision-making in which two physicians independently evaluate prescribing and medications, especially for patients who may be at risk for bias. These measures not only improve the quality of care, but also helped identify physicians who had bias in their practices. The Bryant family, despite their personal suffering, saw their struggle bear fruit. Amina was slowly recovering, and although her health still left much to be desired, her parents knew that her story was an important part of the changes sweeping the medical community. Clara began working at the Bias Victims Fund, supporting families facing discrimination in medicine, and sharing her experiences with them to help them not feel alone. Every night when James returned home, he found support and understanding in his family. Together they created a force that was more than just a desire to punish the guilty. They understood that the real victory was to ensure that never again would any family have to endure the pain they had to endure. That pain became their shared mission, their desire to create a world where every child, every adult, could go to the doctor knowing that they would be treated with care and respect. Amina Bryant's story didn't just shake up medicine, it changed it. Now everyone who heard her name knew they had a long road ahead of them in the fight against bias. Months have passed since the Bryant family first encountered the tragedy that changed their lives forever. Time has slowly moved forward, and despite the constant reminders of the pain they endured, sprouts of hope have begun to emerge in their lives. Throughout this journey, they not only learned the truth about medicine and its shortcomings, but also gained wisdom and inner strength that were with them every step of the way. The main lesson James and Clara learned from this story was the realization that caring for a patient's health goes far beyond professionalism. Medicine requires of every physician not only accurate knowledge, but a sincere commitment to fairness, impartiality, and respect for the lives of everyone who needs help. They realize that every patient, whether child, adult, or elderly, cannot be subject to anyone's prejudices, stereotypes, and beliefs. And that's the lesson the Bryant family decided to bring to the world, because they knew that as long as bias has a place in the system, healthcare remains vulnerable. For James, the hospital owner, what happened was not just an incident, but a moral obligation to make profound changes, starting with himself and his clinic. He now knew that it was not enough for him to believe in the principles of equality and justice. He had to be prepared to uphold them and to prove their importance every day through his own actions. He had to redefine his clinic's value system, making it more open, accessible, and most importantly, safe for every patient. James realized that the fight against bias had to become conscious and systematic, that every hospital employee had to find the strength to look at every patient without prejudice, with a pure, sincere intention to help. For Clara, Amina's mother, the most important lesson was the realization that every parent must be not only caring, but also persistent, especially when it comes to their child's health. She realized that sometimes, in order to protect her loved ones, it is necessary to ask questions, fight for the right to an explanation, and check and recheck prescribed treatments. Clara now knew that parental support and involvement is not an afterthought, but an essential part of treatment, especially when it comes to protecting against errors, bias, or negligence on the part of the medical staff. For Amina herself, this experience was an incomprehensible but profound mark on her life, which affected her soul. At her age, she may not have realized the magnitude of what had happened, but the shadow of those moments when her life depended on the decision of a stranger was now forever etched in her eyes. This lesson left a mark on her that, in time, her parents hoped would become a symbol of her strength and resilience. Despite her youth, she had already learned to appreciate the attention and kindness of others, to see strength in weakness, and the ability to be merciful in empathy. However, the lessons from the incident were not limited to one family. This tragic incident was a reminder to doctors and the medical community that bias in medicine can destroy even the best of intentions. Amina's case clearly demonstrated that a physician's oath and the principles of justice must stand above all beliefs and prejudices. It was an important lesson for anyone who saw themselves as part of the medical world, for bias, as many have now realized, is not just a personal weakness, but a disease that can kill if ignored. At conferences, symposia, universities, and medical schools, this case began to be discussed as a symbol of the dangers of bias and flaws in medical practice. Doctors and students realized that they had a great responsibility to their patients and must be prepared to look honestly inside themselves to see the weaknesses that could cost someone's life. Curricula began to include not only courses on ethics and anti-bias, but also lessons that dealt with real-life stories like Amina's. Doctors who had been working for years and young students were taught that respect for life must come first, even if it required them to reassess their own views and abandon conventional thinking. For the community at large, this case was also a lesson. The The Bryant family shared their story to let people know that everyone has the right to care and equal treatment, and that they must be prepared to defend that right. James and Clara sought to convey to the public that patients should not be afraid to ask questions, should not be embarrassed to voice concerns, and should know that they have the right to respectful and honest treatment. They hoped that their experience would serve as an example to others who may have also experienced unfair treatment or bias in medicine, and that people would begin to demand change when their rights are violated. This case reminded everyone that healthcare should be free of any discrimination, that it should serve the best interests of the individual and not become a place where judgments about a person influence treatment. The Bryant family believed that their experience could be the starting point for hundreds, perhaps thousands, of other changes that could save lives, prevent suffering, and restore people's faith in medicine. In this way, Amina's story was not only a personal tragedy, but also a lesson for society that could not be ignored. It was a story of pain, of betrayal, and of loss, but it was also a story of justice, compassion, and triumph over prejudice. Amina Bryant's story has come to symbolize the struggle for justice and change. Overcoming pain and bitterness, her family emerged with a new understanding of what it takes to ensure that tragedies like this never happen again. James, Clara, and their daughter carried through those difficult months not only the memories of their ordeal, but also a strong belief that their efforts could make a difference in the world of medicine. Now that the Bryant family could look back and see how much they had accomplished, they realized that their pain had not been in vain. James Hospital became a model for the rest of the medical community. Not only were rules and protocols updated, but a new, unwavering commitment to equity and justice settled into its very atmosphere. On every floor were signs reminding patients that every patient, regardless of race, social status, or background, had the right to the best possible care, and that doctors had as much a duty to fight for that right as they did to save lives. For James, this was not just a new chapter in the life of his hospital. It was more than that. It was a contribution to the common good, an attempt to build a bridge between what is and what should be. Since Amina's story traveled the country, he has met with dozens of clinical, academic, and health department leaders, telling them about the changes he has implemented and urging them to follow his lead. He shared his pain, his experience, and his hope for the future. He said that medicine should strive to make every patient, every life, worth its weight in gold, and that doctors should see their patients not just as diagnoses and symptoms, but as people with their own stories, fears, and dreams. These ideas resonated. Over time, slow but tangible changes began to emerge. Medical schools added mandatory courses in cultural competency and anti-discrimination. Future doctors were taught not only anatomy and physiology, but also respect for every person, regardless of their background or social circumstances. The new doctors and nurses left university with a deeper appreciation of what it means to be a real doctor. Their mentors increasingly told them, "Your duty is not only to treat disease, but also to protect human dignity." But what was most inspiring to James was that the change was visible not only in policies and protocols, but also in people's hearts. Inspired by Amina's story, doctors began to look at their work differently, becoming more thoughtful and informed in every decision they made. Amina's story reminded many of them of why they chose this profession. Her suffering and resilience inspired them to strive for the best and helped them to remember the ideals that guided them when they first started their journey in medicine. For the Bryant family, the fight for justice became a symbol of their own inner strength. Clara found solace in the work of the foundation, supporting families who faced bias and injustice. She became a voice for those who needed support and encouragement, those who, like herself, had once felt the pain of betrayal and despair. Clara saw that her efforts helped people not only to cope with their pain, but also to find the strength to fight for their future. Amina, despite her condition, gradually regained her mental strength. Every day her parents saw her coming back to life, and her eyes, once full of fear, began to shine again. Her health may have remained vulnerable, but her spirit was strong, and each day she lived was a step toward recovery. She grew up knowing that her story was meaningful to so many people, that her pain brought change that now protects other children. James and Clara often told her that her resilience helped change the world, and that thought helped Amina feel needed and strong despite her trials. Everything the Bryant family went through became part of their new mission. They lived to protect, inspire, and lead. And each time they remembered this story, they found new strength to fight for equality and justice. They knew that the journey was endless, that there was still much work to be done. But their story, their pain, and their hope had already begun to change the lives of others. James, Clara, and Amina now realized that their experience was not only a challenge, but a chance for change. Their story became a call to action for every doctor, every parent, and every patient to demand respect, justice, and protection. This story may not have been able to save their family from pain, but it was able to give them and the entire community a light of hope for a better future. And despite the hardships, the Bryant family believed that their fight for justice was a worthy one. They knew that this struggle would not bring back Amina's lost health, but perhaps it would save someone's life, someone's fate, someone's family. They lived to remember, to fight, and to make a difference in the world, one step at a time, one life at a time. And perhaps one day the day will come when the world of medicine will truly be free of bias, when the hospital will be a safe place for everyone, when everyone will be able to come for help and find it without fear. That was their hope for change. Friends, we would love to know your opinion about this story in the comments. Have you experienced bias or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and stories are very important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if you found it interesting. We wish you a great day and inspiration on your journey towards goodness and justice.